Hi, this is Marina from frocksandfrolics.com, and this is a sew along for the Charlie Brown coat, which is part of the Ottobre celebration magazine. And you can sew it with me. There is a whole playlist with all the chapters in it. And in this chapter, we're going to sew together our lining, and we're also going to insert the collar we've made previously. And then the coat's going to be absolutely beautiful, just like you can see here. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is to put on our collar, which we've made previously, and we're going to put the center back of the jacket to the center back of the collar, and then we're going to pin that on from that point forwards. And on your pattern piece you will also have had a marking, and so if you haven't marked that, then just take your pattern piece like I am doing here and make sure that it sits right on that mark. And you can see here that the address for ottobredesign.com, so that you can get your own. What I really like about these magazine patterns from Ottobre is that any pattern you can still get, any magazine. This is actually 10 years old, this magazine, but I absolutely love it, and especially this coat. So what you want to make sure is that in this area here, nothing can fold over. So we're going to put a few pins in vertical to the seam so that that can't happen. You could also secure the shoulder seam in the same way. And then I go to the other side, and again I get my pattern piece out because I haven't marked it, or if I've marked it I can't find it anymore. And so I just put that on, take a pin, mark the point to which I will have to pin on my collar, and then I can just do that. So I go to the end and then I put both on top of each other and I check that they are in the same position, and if they are, then brilliant, and if they're not, I'm going to adjust it, of course. Here I think I adjusted it a tiny little bit. There we go, and now we're perfectly ready to go. Just ease in the rest of the collar. And then we go over to the sewing machine and we're going to sew this in. And on this side, actually, I'm also going to put a pin vertical to the seam so that nothing can fold over. And as you can see blended in, you can follow me on Instagram if you like. Let's go sew this in. I have a seam allowance of 1 centimeter. The seam allowance is not included, but you can add whatever seam allowance you want to it once you've traced out the pattern. And how to do that you will find in the first part of this little course on how to make this beautiful jacket, and I explain it all to you. Of course, you could choose a different seam allowance. I'm using the 1 centimeter. You could do the 1.5, which is used by Buttrick and by most of these big 4 pattern companies. So if you, for example, on the side seam say, well, I actually want it 1.5, then you can do that. You could even go to 2 centimeters if it's a heavy wool. So that's all very flexible. Secure your stitches, and there we go. That looks really nice. Now the other thing that you want to do is always make sure that everything is as flat as possible. So I'm cutting back my seam allowances here. That's all I can do really, because although I would really like to cut the collar back, if I did that it would start getting really bulky because my seam allowance is only 1 centimeter. So I'm leaving it as it is, and it will then fold out really lovely. This is such a nice collar and it's very easy to make. Right, that's it. I am just going to check it, and if I turn it over you can see how it sits around the neck at the back. It's really, really nice actually. So compliments again to Ottobre. Make sure that there's no pleats in there. It's all inserted beautifully, and if it is, you can put this away, give yourself a pat on the back, and we're going to start now with the lining. Now we are going to begin here with the back. So the two backs are put on top of each other. Make sure that when you sew together the center back that you leave the seam allowance at the lower end, and that you place it in front of you like I've done here, so the cutout part faces you. The right sides are of course on the inside, and the side that sticks out from our vent is the one that's underneath. And then after that, we can put the yoke on, but we need to sew together the back first. Always look at your instructions, by the way. I think that's very helpful. Now, one thing you need to remember is that your lining is slightly shorter than your facing. Okay, so when I put these on top of each other, you could also just put them on top of each other, overlapping, minus the seam allowance. You could do that too. You will see that the lining is about 4 centimeters less than the actual facing. And that's what we need to mark for ourselves so that we can then say, okay, this is how far my lining has to go down. And why that is, you'll see when we sew together. It's a really simple trick, and they've done it very well here. Now, what I actually found in the end, that I only used 2.5 centimeters because my fabric pushed a bit. And although it's great when you can get it into the 4 centimeters, because that's how it should be, don't worry if your lining ends up a little bit lower. It just shouldn't go all the way to the end. That would be wrong. Then you pin it to the facing with the right sides together, of course, all the way up that straight edge. And then where you get the curve, you stop and you put a pin at the top end, and then you kind of ease in the lining to the facing. Now it will feel like there's too much fabric of the lining, but actually there isn't. And that's only because the two rounded edges are sitting on top of each other and they go in opposite directions. And so it does feel like you have too much fabric, but you actually don't. So you need to round that in. And then the other thing that I found out very quickly, and you're going to watch me struggle now, is that it would have been much better to have pinned this from the side of the facing. And before I go on the sewing machine, I also put together my sleeves. We have got an underarm sleeve and then we've got the sleeves. So we want to put that together. Again, my seam allowance that I decided to do was 1 centimeter. And I pin that all the way down. Now we will need a turning gap either in the sleeve or in the side seam, and Ottobre suggests the side seam of the lining. How you do that doesn't really matter. Sometimes it's nicer to have it on this sleeve because you don't ever see that, and if you stitch the seam over when you're done with it all, then well, of course the sleeve one is the better one because you don't see that, and you have to be a little bit more tidy when you do it on the side seam. I did it on the side seam because that's what Ottobre suggests. So make sure that you start your pinning together here, so you have like one standing over the other a little bit. That's because of the seam allowances, of course, that needs to sit exactly on top of each other. Then I'm going to do my hanging loop. That's 3 centimeters wide, 12 centimeters long. I iron that over to the middle, and then I iron both sides to the center. Just don't go all the way, just go a little bit, because otherwise it's going to be bulky. And then give that a good press over to the sewing machine, and we're going to top stitch this from both sides. And again, when you're top stitching, always use a really long stitch length, 3.5, 4, that will be good. I swing this round, do the same on the other side. Beautiful. And then we go on to the next bit, and that is, ta-da, my sleeve. So here we have, again, a stitch length of 2.5. It's very important that you don't forget to put it back down. If you just put it up, that's one of my pet things to do. I always do that. Forget to put it back down or back up, and then I go, oh no, I forgot. So put your stitch length back down to 2.5. Go on both sides. Obviously do that to both sleeves, and we're going to sew everything together before we go back and iron it. That makes it much easier. Of course, you could do the sleeves, then iron it, and then come back to the sewing machine, but we're going straight on to the center back now. Make sure that you leave that centimeter at the lower end so that the seam allowance is there, and then you're going to sew that together as well. And then we sew together the facing. And here you see what I was talking about earlier. So I'm trying to get this in, and already my lining is pushing like crazy. This was like sewing velvet, which is very, very difficult. And I got about to this point and then decided that this was a really bad idea. I took it out and I repinned the top part of it where I have the curve from the other side, which is way more stable, and that will then transport super duper, and it's just not working. So out it came, and I thought, nope, not doing that. And so you can see here how much easier that is. I would just recommend that you just do it right from the start. I didn't expect it to push that much, so as you can see here, this is the other side. I just pinned it all the way to the end, and it did push here, even there a little bit, and you will see now that I end up with about 2.5 centimeters there on the other side, and that's perfectly okay, right? It's a little bit less than I would have liked it, but it's okay. Now we're going to top stitch this seam, and we're going to stitch on top of the seam allowance. So the seam allowance needs to face into the lining. That is the nice flannel or brushed cotton, and again I'm using a stitch length 3.5 or even 4, so you need to put that up and go all the way to the end. Yep, reverse your stitches. There you go, beautiful. Now we're going to give it a good press. Always really important, don't leave ironing to the end, especially with a jacket like this. You're never really going to iron it again as well as this. Now make sure that when you iron your back, that the vent part which stands out is facing you when you iron the seam towards you. So keep that vent on the left and do exactly what I do, and it'll be perfectly fine. And then we can turn it over and do it from the other side as well. So there we go. And in this area here where we're going to snip, I decided to add something to it. Iron-on interfacing on there because I don't want that to rip out, because we are going to cut in there. So cut yourself a little shape there that fits underneath it like that. And then we're just going to stick that under, so make sure that when you cut it out that the sticky side of your interfacing is facing up. Then we turn it over, put that interfacing on and iron it on. There we go. That will make it a little bit more secure, and I'm very excited about the next part because we're going to put the vent in, so don't miss that one. Make sure that you watch that too when it comes out. So now we're going to attach the yoke to the back as well, and really you don't need to pin this. I mean, seriously, put one pin at the beginning and then just stitch it on. Make sure that the center back of the yoke and the center back of the lining is in the same position. Hold the end, make sure the rough edges are on top of each other, and just go. There's no need to overpin these sort of things. And then we do the same again. We're going to top stitch it. So force the fabric apart, the seam lies into the back yoke, and then we're going to stitch it all the way to the other side. And I actually did 2 stitching lines. There we go. Excellent. And if you have got your own labels, please do put it in at this point. Make sure that you account for the seam allowance at the neckline, which we haven't used yet. So you need to make sure it's centered and then 1 centimeter down to fit well. and I'm stitching all the way around, and you can see here it still says made in England, although I do live in Los Angeles now, as you all know probably. And I had these labels for a very long time because I made flower girl dresses which I sold on Amazon, and they had this label in, and I've got like hundreds of them left. And so I like to put my label in. I think it looks professional, and I would, if I was you, get yourself some labels so at least people know, yep, that was made by you. Now we're also going to put the hanger on. I've ironed mine over a little bit, and then it's about 2.5 or 2 centimeters to either side of the back, so it's in line with my label here. That's what I thought looks really good. So you can pin and stitch that on, and then I'm ironing apart my sleeves as well. So we're going back to that now, and we also need to round those a little bit here. So what I'm going to do is put an easing stitch in here, and that will really guarantee that I can put this sleeve in really easy when we do it in a minute. So you're using the longest stitch length available on your sewing machine, so 4 or 5 or even 6, it depends on your sewing machine, to be honest. And then I'm doing another stitch right next to it, and then when you stitch it, you stitch right through the center. We're only going to steam it in a little bit, so we don't need a lot of gather. You're just picking up the threads that face you on the underside of the fabric. Don't pull them all, because that's just locking in all the stitches, but I expect that you know that, because nobody that's a beginner will make this coat. And if you are, I would advise you not to do it. This is not a beginner thing, is it? But if you've sewn for a while and you want to just like increase what you can do, then yeah, this is a fantastic jacket. So now we're going to steam it in. It's just so it can round over really nicely. And once that's done, well, that's really easy. There you go. Lovely. Do that on both of them. And once we've done that, we've completed the sleeves, and we can go on to the next step. Now we're going to take our front and our back, and we're going to put them together. So we're going to sew the shoulder seams together and the side seams. And the side seams need to have that turning gap. And you don't want to make that too small. It needs to be quite generous, because you will rip that seam, because the jacket is really heavy and you absolutely don't want that to be a hardship to turn through. Okay, so leave a good chunk open. And of course, I forget it every single time. I always have to open it up afterwards. One of the things you can do is you just sew the seam up to where you want your turning gap to be, and then use a long stitch and then go back to a smaller stitch where it ends. And that works really well. Then you can iron it and then undo where you want the turning gap to be. So that's one way of doing it. Of course, I forgot it. So now we're going to just close that shoulder seam. So what you want to do is just put the ends on top of each other, the rough edges on top of each other, and then I'm going to do it just with the 1 centimeter seam allowance. And now I'm going to do the side seam, where of course I said you need to leave a turning gap. So I would stop about here, reverse stitch, and then go on with stitch length 4, and then go right down to about here, then reverse stitch again, and then carry on with stitch length 2.5 to the end, and then we can open up the stitch length 4 part once we've ironed it. So now I'm going to iron my shoulder seams, and they go towards the back, because otherwise it would be way too thick to have them apart. Always a lighter fabric needs to be the one that's folded over, of course. And then I iron apart the side seam, and like I said, I would just pop the turning gap open afterwards, and then you know exactly what you need to put on top of each other. Now we're going to do the sleeves, and just make sure that we know which one is the front. So the front's always cut away a little bit more. And also that seam at the back sits on the back seam of the coat as well, almost. So that's how you know. So put the underarm seam onto the marking that you've got on your sleeve. Turn the jacket round. We also got a marking on the sleeve head that needs to go onto the shoulder. And so I pin that as well. And because we've steamed it in, it's really, really easy to put this in. I have to say, hats off to Ottobre. They did a really good job with this sleeve. I think for a girl, I might make it a little bit slimmer, but I've already heard from Ella, who's my friend, and her daughter is the little Magdalena, my model. And she said it was actually really nice to have a wider sleeve so you can get all sorts of jumpers under it. Because originally, of course, this is a boy's coat and it's meant to be made for boys and they have wider sleeves. But she really liked that sleeve. So for this one, I would just keep it as it is if you're making it for a girl. Obviously, it's more practical, but slimmer sleeve looks nicer, I think. So now I'm also going to make sure that none of my seams can fold over. So just put a vertical pin in there. And then check from the outside that it really lies nicely on there. You can see that these seams are almost at the same point. It's like a tiny little bit different, and that's absolutely fine. And then I'm going to do exactly the same on the other side. I put it on my left arm this time, and then I go through the armhole, and again I pin it to the marking that we've got on the sleeve. Align that with your side seam, and off you go. Really easy. Turn it over, pin it in. Brilliant. We continue that now, and when that is also done, we can almost go and put it in, right? So let's have another look if this is also really nice. So turn that sleeve once you've done it. That looks really good, little hole there. So we can now go to the sewing machine and sew these babies in all the way around. You always want to sew a sleeve in from the inside so that you can turn the sleeve as you go, and you always feed the sleeve in absolutely straight, so don't try to sort of force it round. Always make sure that you put the fabric round so that where you're sewing is fed in completely straight. Always make sure also that underneath it nothing has crumpled up, that the edges are on top of each other. Hold it. This is not a quick thing. A nice sleeve is never that easy, and I would recommend that you do it in this order. So you put this sleeve in first so you're familiar about how much you need to roughly steam in so that it sits really nicely. It's a really good practice run to do the lining and then do the actual sleeve. It's very tempting to do the sleeve at the time when you're actually making the sleeve. You could have put it in straight after, but I think it's nicer to do it this way around because you actually get a little bit of practice here. There we go. And now I'm all the way around. Secure my stitches. And because, of course, the lining's on the inside, we don't need to serge or overlock any of it. All we need to do now is to give this a jolly good press. And here we do something that's a real no-no otherwise, and that is we are going to press all of the seams into the sleeve and make it really nice and flat so they can't move. Now you never ever want to do that with something that's seen to the outside on a jacket because it's going to flatten the sleeve head. Not something that looks nice on the outside, but on the inside that's perfectly good. So you can just steam this all in. The seam goes into the sleeve and that will give you a beautiful result, and it won't go anywhere. That's the main thing. So it doesn't crumple up underneath there like it always wants to do. So give this a really good press all the way around. Turn it over to the other side as well. Good press. There we go. Wonderful. Now that sleeve is also done. We are at the final stages here. We just need to cut some threads off, and then in the next chapter we're actually going to put this lining in, and we're also going to put the sleeves in to the actual jacket, and also we're going to make the vent. So I'll see you there next week. Bye for now.